changing your life one story at a time. This is the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast with Editor-in-Chief Amy Newmark.
Hey, it's Amy Newmark with your daily dose of Chicken Soup for the Soul inspiration. It's Thoughtful Thursday. That's the day when I get to share a story that gave me new perspective, that made me stop and think. I'm lucky to be exposed to all these stories. You know, we get thousands of submissions for every one of our books, and we have to narrow it down to only 101 that go into each book. So you can imagine how much these stories are the cream of the crop. Today's story is one of the 101 that made it into an awesome book called Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and Premonitions. It's a very cool book, and it contains lots of stories that dramatically illustrate why it's so important to listen to our dreams. In this story, which is called Wake Up Call, Dreama Drudge tells us about walking into the funeral home to see her husband. She smelled the overwhelming scent of all those different types of flowers mixed together. She saw that gleaming oak casket, and she bent down to say her final farewell to her husband. And then, mercifully, Dreama woke up, crying, and realized it was just a dream. But then she looked over at her husband's side of the bed, and he wasn't there. She was panic-stricken for a moment, and then she realized he had gone into work early that day. She was still nervous, though, so she called him at work just to make sure he was okay. Uncharacteristically, she said on the phone to him, "I love you." Dreama says, and I quote, "We had been going through a challenging time in our marriage for the past 2 years. We'd moved to a new state where the work my husband had hoped for hadn't materialized. We had 2 newly adopted older children with emotional problems. Even though we ended up returning to Indiana and a secure job for my husband, I fell apart. I hadn't recovered from the years of worrying about money. I resented my husband for it, and I didn't know how to change my attitude." Dreama says she tried prayer, self-help books, talking to friends, all to no avail. So she just pushed the problem to the side, focused on her own life, and ignored her husband. She went back to college, which was very expensive. She made a new set of friends, and she went out with these friends nearly every weekend, leaving her husband out of her social life. Dreama says she was acting like a teenager, but that dream opened Dreama's eyes to all the good things about her husband. He had been working overtime to pay for her college classes. He cooked on the nights she had to study for exams, and he drove her to some of those social events that she had with her new friends, the ones she was leaving him out of. She says she was deeply ashamed of her behavior. Dreama says in her story, "I owed this man so much more than an apology, and I quickly got busy." She cleaned the house thoroughly for the first time in a long time. She went shopping and bought a new dress that she thought her husband would like. Then she got her hair done, and then she went and bought groceries to make her husband his favorite dinner of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. She also stocked up on his favorite snacks, something else she hadn't bothered to do in a long time. When her husband came home that night, he found Dreama dressed up and waiting for him at the front door, holding a blue envelope. And that envelope held a card, and that card contained an apology for her behavior, for complaining, for nagging, for focusing on the negative and downplaying the positive. After he read the card, he and Dreama broke down in tears, and that night they talked. The first good talk they'd had in a long time. Dreama assured him she wouldn't take him for granted again. Dreama says she keeps going back to that nightmare and how devastated she would be if it ever came true, if she really lost her husband. She won't forget, and I think it's a great reminder for me and for you as well, to make sure there isn't someone in our lives we've been taking for granted, whether it's a spouse, a friend, somebody at work, somebody we know in our community. In our next podcast, we're going to talk to a woman who did actually lose a family member, and in a horrible way. Another one of those mass shootings. She's going to tell us how she came to grips with this tragedy and how she even became friends with the sister of the shooter. I'm Amy Newmark. Thanks so much for listening to the Chicken Soup for the Soul podcast today. I'd love it if you would help me spread the word by telling your friends about the podcast. You can also rate it on the iTunes page. And if you'd like to read more thought-provoking, life-changing stories from the book I mentioned today, Chicken Soup for the Soul, Dreams and Premonitions, then go to our website, chickensoup.com.